Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be giving this lecture because actually Raymond Williams went to my school. So he was always a local writer who was very, very close to my heart, and it made a massive difference, I think, actually, growing up in the same area, knowing that I was living amongst the same hills, the same landscape that he had first sort of tried out his own eyes and ears. And it was a very real inspiration for me as a young writer. But also thank you to all of you for being here, because I'll be honest, after a few months of Dylan Thomas's centenary, I'm just a little bit sick of Dylan Thomas, actually, which might not sound like the best way to start an hour lecture on his work, but there you go. No, but obviously, as I'm sure you understand, I don't mean Thomas the man. I never got to meet him, sadly, although it's extraordinary to think that had he not died at exactly the age I am now, 39, which feels increasingly young, I can tell you that now, then actually many of us probably would have had the chance to meet him. And I suppose that's always one of the most tantalizing questions about Thomas, is that question of what would have happened next. And I'm not sick of his work either, and certainly not the best of his work, which we'll be talking about this afternoon. But I'm a bit sick of the public ideas of him, both as a person and a poet, and the mythic quality of the narratives that have crystallized about him, and in the process, I think, have increasingly obscured his work. I suppose it's the story of him that has so dominated the recent articles and dramas and the several films that are about to come out about him. Those are what I've probably had enough of. And we all know them as a person, the drunk, the womanizer, the buck leper at the Anglo-Saxon court, as Seamus Heaney once put it, the instinctive and Dionysian Celtic poet who is gifted with great talent, but cursed too with a gift for self-destruction. And as a poet, I suppose the popular story is it's about that sonic boom of a voice that made him such a hypnotic performer, a poet perhaps of sound over content, maybe even something of a bardic trickster, all mouth and no trousers, so to speak. Now, yeah, we'll let that one leave there because there are other people who could argue the other way, I'm sure. Now, I'm not saying that some of these opinions aren't based in some elements of fact, but they are far from the whole story, and as far as I'm concerned, they're certainly not the most interesting story about Thomas. That, I believe, is a story that lies in a much more private place, the private place from which all of his public fame and recognition first grew, the solitary and lonely yet intimate place of the poet who is sitting down in front of the page to write. Now, one of the titles that I've given this lecture, because I think if you can give something more than one title, you should. I think Thomas would have approved. So it's called Singing in Chains, His Sullen Art. Now, that second phrase, I'm sure that you'll know, comes from one of Thomas's own poems, In My Craft or Sullen Art. And in that poem, Thomas is using the word sullen in its original Anglo-Saxon sense to mean solitary, almost withdrawn. And that's what I'd like to try to do over this next hour, is to move us away from those well-worn public ideas of Thomas and back towards his solitary art, which was what actually created his extraordinary, unique voice. And in the process, I want to ask some questions about that voice. First, simply, where did it come from? Every poet's voice, I think, is partly born within them, but it is also partly learnt, inherited, and it grows from influence. So what were the influences that were feeding into the young Thomas? I mean the very young Thomas as he was first beginning his relationship with language. I also want to ask quite simply, why did his poems catch and continue to catch the popular public's imagination with such fervour? Because there's no doubt that whatever you might think about the various qualities of Thomas as a poet, he was a seismic event in English language poetry. And that's why it's so important to get back to this story of him as a poet. Because no poet had written like him before. We can see where he's come from. We can see when he's drawing upon Blake and Donne, but no one had quite done what he'd done before. And certainly no one has followed in his wake successfully. His early poems, published when still a teenager, heralded the arrival of a fully formed and compelling voice, which elevated poetry to elemental occasion. This was poetry as event, if you like. Here were poems at once emotionally lucid and yet narratively obscure. Poems in which the cry of the human heart was uttered simultaneously to the most intimate depths of the body and outward to the universal workings of the cosmos, fueled by a percussive rhythm, often more reminiscent of the circulatory system, actually, rather than standard meter, and written in a pseudo-biblical, maybe even metaphysical idiolect. I think it's no surprise that when Thomas's poems that were written here in Wales, when they first landed in literary London in 1930s, they did so with significant impact. And they continue to do so at the end of his writing life, which was just 20 years after those first poems were published. And that's something we have to keep in front of our eyes. Most poets in their late 30s are just getting going. You're just getting started. You're really beginning your apprenticeship. And that's when Thomas left us. But at the end of his writing life, Philip Larkin confirmed the lasting resonance of that impact when he placed Thomas alongside Auden and Eliot in a trinity of contemporary poetic influence. "I can't believe that D.T. is dead," he wrote when he was told that he had died in New York in 1953. "It seems absurd. 3 people who've altered the face of poetry, and the youngest had to die." But I also want to ask, what happened to Thomas's poetry in the space of those 20 years? What was the nature of his evolution, if there was evolution? And lastly, why is he a poet of such contrast, which I think he is? He's a poet who loved and exploited the modern world. He was on trams and cars, he was flying across the Atlantic, he absolutely embraced the media of the day, television and radio. He was a very gifted radio performer and writer. And yet his poetry, the modern world barely ever arrives in it. Or when it does, in a poem such as Our Eunuch Dreams, which is actually a fantastic poem about cinema, it's very hard to tell that the modern world is there. So his poetry, although he's immersed in the world, seems to be almost alienated from the lived life of his readers and of the poet himself. He's also an elusive, complex, technically brilliant and difficult poet who, for some reason, has been shunned by the academy. And yet at the same time, he's often taken to heart by people who don't read any other poetry. So there's a real contrast there as well. And I think we've seen that this year when he's been very present in the popular media, on TV and radio. But actually, is he studied in most of our universities? No, he's not. And lastly, just a small thing, but it's always fascinated me, he's a poet whose first lines and last lines are known by millions, but whose poems as a whole often are not. So, to begin at the beginning, it had to happen, and it was probably best it happened early, which obviously it would, because it's the beginning. I'll continue. So to begin at the beginning, what were those early influences that were feeding into his voice? Well, I think, perhaps like most poets, but I think more so for Thomas, those influences are to be found in the geography of his childhood, and we can sort of trace them, I think, in a series of expanding concentric circles, beginning at the place where he was born, number 5, Cwmdonkin Drive, which I do want to say has been fantastically restored. And I only found out recently that you can actually rent it, and you can stay there, and you can sleep in Thomas's room. So you should all rush to be the first people after this to do that, because it's a beautiful house. It's if not for Thomas, it's just got a wonderful colour scheme, actually. It's like a Farrow and Ball advert. Anyway, it is, in the best sense. It almost sounds like a Thomas poem, actually, when you read the colours of the walls, you know, blackened, burnt, snow, rectory, red, pea shoot green, and it's all Farrow and Ball. Anyway, moving on. So yes, Cwmdonkin Drive is this solid and generous semi-detached house in the middle-class uplands area of Swansea, and it was here, under the doting care of his mother Florence and the guiding hand of his English teacher, Father DJ, that Thomas began life as a poet. And he did so, if he is to be believed, not by reading or writing, but actually by listening, and long before he could actually read or write. The first poems I knew were nursery rhymes, and before I could read them myself, I had come to love just the words of them alone. This is how Thomas starts a letter in 1951 to a research student inquiring after his early influences. 2 years later, Thomas would be dead. So this letter is really the closest thing we have to his personal manifesto. And it was something that Thomas took very seriously, actually, responding to students' work. We hear stories about him being very glib with the faculty in America, but actually he could devote a lot of time to the students and not just the young female attractive ones. What the words stood for, he continues, symbolized or meant, was of very secondary importance. What mattered was the sound of them as I heard them for the first time on the lips of the remote and incomprehensible grown-ups. I cared for the colors the words cast on my eyes. I fell in love. That is the only expression I can think of at once, and I'm still at the mercy of words. Here, then, I think, is the foundation of Thomas's poetic experience. The sound of words, not their meanings. What words conjure more than what they define. It's a childhood experience that will eventually evolve into Thomas's most often repeated theory on the composition of his poems. And this is his concept that he talks about again and again of writing from words, not towards words. Now that sounds as if he's being a bit tricky sometimes, but what he means by this is whereas one poet might reach towards words as the medium through which to express a thought or an experience, for Thomas, the experience, the thought, and the words all arrive at the same time. And he's responding to the words, not writing towards them. So an example of this is, I think, the first poem in his first collection, I See the Boys of Summer in Their Ruin. Thomas wrote this after seeing a bunch of middle-aged men about to go swimming on the beach in Swansea. But the finished poem is not a description of these old men. It's not even really about them specifically, but it's informed by the emotional tone of the words that were evoked in Thomas when he saw them. And the poem that we read today, with its series of oppositions, of images of youth and aging, still carries, I think, the afterglow of that scene on the beach, if not an actual description of it. I see the boys of summer in their ruin, lay the gold tithings barren, setting no store by harvest, freeze the soils. There in their heat, the winter floods of frozen loves, they fetch their girls and drown the cargoed apples in their tides. So as Thomas once said, the word is the object, and it's in response to those words, their rhythms, their associations, their shades, and their notes that he writes. But it would be a mistake, I think, to equate this primacy of the texture and colour of words with a purely instinctive mind that is creating in isolation. Thomas was an instinctive poet. He was gifted with a natural composer's ear for the emotional penumbra of words. But he was, too, a scholar of his art who read widely and thought deeply on his own poetry and the poetry of others. So once old enough, it was his father's study, it was DJ's study that was packed full of literature that became the fuel to his aspirations. And in that 1951 letter, that is reflected in the list of writers that he cites as being his early influences. De Quincey, Henry Newbolt, the Ballads, Blake, Baroness Orczy, Marlowe, Chums, the Imagists, the Bible, Poe, Keats, Lawrence, Anon, and Shakespeare. Not really leaving anyone out, although he did leave out Donne, interestingly, which I think who was a very important influence. And, of course, Gerald Manley Hopkins. Now, I'm not going to touch upon Hopkins in this lecture because although he looks like the poet, most obviously having inherited his English language poetry from Cynhanydd, from the Welsh form, and terming it sprung rhythm, and with lots of assonance and sort of mirrored alliteration, he looks like this is the poet who Thomas has grown from. But Thomas himself, if we're to believe the poet, said that that's not true and that he didn't read much Gerald Manley Hopkins, but we'll leave that one to one side for now. But what I think was equally important, and which isn't talked about enough, I think, certainly not outside Wales, is that as well as being fed by the writers of the past within Cymdoncyn Drive, Thomas was also being provoked and challenged by the chums that he includes in that list, because it was a particularly lively intellectual environment in Swansea outside of Number 5 as well. The composer Dan Jones, the poet Vernon Watkins, the artist Alfred Janes, they were all members of the now famous Cardimer Gang, the group of friends who met in the cafe of the same name opposite the Evening Post where Thomas worked to talk about their arts. Even his local grocer, the socialist grocer Bert Trick, was a vital literary spur to Thomas when he challenged him in a competition to write a poem about immortality. And the teenage Thomas came back with, "And death shall have no dominion." And you've got to feel sorry for Bert Trick at that point, haven't you, really? I mean, he's probably thinking, oh, go on, I'll give the lad a little bit of encouragement, give me a lot. Bloody hell. Oddly, we don't have Bernard's poem either, but Bert's poem, sorry. But he was, and actually he was vital for Thomas in really encouraging him in art and introducing him to writers like Craddock Evans, who's my people, I think, is a very interesting influence upon Undermilt Wood. So there was this very, very lively intellectual scene. But of the group, it was undoubtedly Vernon Watkins who was the most important sounding board and sparring partner. It was with and against Watkins that Thomas honed his thoughts of what he wanted a poem to do and what he wanted it to be. In this 1938 letter, in which he is commenting on Watkins's work, he once again returns to that idea of the inevitable rather than the chosen word. All the words are lovely, he writes, but they seem so chosen, not struck out. I can see the sensitive picking of words, but none of the strong, inevitable pulling that makes a poem an event, a happening, an action perhaps. I think I ask you for a little creative destruction, destructive creation. And I love those last phrases because I think they lie at the heart of Thomas's work. And maybe we could argue at the heart of his life as well, unfortunately. But I think maybe of even more importance outside of Swansea was the wider cultural landscape of 1930s Wales and Thomas's geographical and familial location within it, because his parents were the personification of the intellectual and industrial movement from rural to urban that so characterised Wales in the early 20th century. And because of this, although Thomas was raised in an urban environment and largely Anglophone Swansea, as a young boy, a listener in love with words, he also found himself at the centre of a linguistic and cultural maelstrom. So it meant that both the languages of Welsh and English informed his ear, just as much the streets of Swansea and the fertile fields of the Llanstefan Peninsula informed his eye. And I think that's really vital for Thomas. He had access to these contrasting and yet very complementary Welsh landscapes and all of the language and the vocabulary that came with them. And of course we see this in his poems, in his later poems. The farm where he spent a lot of his childhood, Fern Hill, becomes a particularly rich scene for him in later life. This is the land that he sees both in his memories and literally when he takes the walk in Poem in October. If any of you ever follow that walk and you go up onto Sir John's Hill, he's literally looking across at Fern Hill. So there's an amazing combination of immediacy and nostalgia in both of those rural poems, Fern Hill and Poem in October. And it's partly because he was writing out of memory, but also out of the landscape that he was actually in. And it also becomes this landscape, obviously, that he harnesses to embody a brief pastoral innocence in the poem Fern Hill. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home in the sun that is young once only. Now, in a schoolboy essay on modern poetry, when he was just 15 years old, Thomas was already observing that poetry was entering a transition period. No poet can find sure ground, he writes. He is hunting for it, with the whole earth perturbed and unsettled about him. Now, Thomas himself at 15 had already begun that hunt, as we know, because we have access to his notebooks, and these are the notebook poems. And it's an extraordinary thing to have access to, because you can follow his search for a voice, almost as if following his route on a map. And one of the things you see when you follow that route is that although he was obviously aware of the dominant styles of the day, Auden and Spender, a fascination with the surface of things, a demotic speech, a rhythm that is inherited from everyday speech, he did not want to follow the herd. He's informed by the established, by the canon, but he's desperately aspirational for the new. And unsurprisingly, given his age, I think he's driven by some very familiar teenage engines of concern, obsessions with mortality, this human situation of being born into death, an acute awareness of the body and its physical processes, and a real desire to tear through the established fabric. Poetry finds its own form, he wrote in 1933. Form should never be superimposed. The structure should rise out of the words and the expression of them. I do not want to express only what other people have felt. I want to rip something away and show what they have never seen. And I think it's that motivation, it's that desire that leads us into the later notebook poems, which interestingly begin with rhymed verse, very conventional, very regular rhymed verse. He then goes through a period of free verse, imitations really of Auden and Spender, before returning to a stronger sense of patterning and rhyme, but less regular. combined with that desire to show people what they have never seen before. And it's this that brings us into the poems of his first collection, which is simply called 18 Poems. So how does Thomas make his entrance onto the literary scene? Well, it's with one of those poems when, at the age of 19, he publishes Light Breaks When No Sun Shines in the BBC's Listener magazine. This was the poem that would change his life. It's the poem that would see him suddenly catapulted from the sullen art of his bedroom into public life, pretty much for the rest of his life. So I thought, because of that, it's pretty important that we should hear it. I also thought that it's probably time that we all have a break from my voice. I know I want a break from my voice. So I've got some assistance with reading these poems, but not from Thomas himself. And the reason I've done that is because we're here to talk about his voice on the page. But we all know that he became equally famous for his voice on the stage. And while that reading voice is undoubtedly hypnotic and impressive, I've always found it to be something of a sonic tautology, if you like. Because already on the page, Thomas is a one-man male voice choir. And so if you add to that this booming, oddly Welsh RP, I think it can be unhelpful, and we start to blur the words. So what I've got some clips from a documentary that I made about Thomas's poetry, which is going out on BBC4 next Sunday, June the 1st. Thomas would have approved of that plug. And so I've got 3 poets to read the 3 poems that we're going to hear, and we're going to start off with, I hope that we can see this, with Claire Pollard reading Light Breaks When No Sun Shines.
Light breaks where no sun shines. Where no sea runs, the waters of the heart push in their tides. And broken ghosts with glowworms in their heads, the things of light, file through the flesh where no flesh decks the bone. A candle in the thighs warms youth and seed and burns the seed of age, where no seed stirs, the fruit of man unwrinkles in the stars, bright as a fig. Where no wax is, the candle shows its hairs. Dawn breaks behind the eyes. From poles of skull and toe, the windy blood slides like a sea. Nor fenced nor staked, the gushers of the sky spout to the rod, divining in a smile the oil of tears. Night in the sockets rounds like some pitch moon, the limit of the globes. Day lights the bone, where no cold is, the skinning gales unpin the winter's robes. The film of spring is hanging from the lids. Light breaks on secret lots, on tips of thought where thoughts smell in the rain. When logics die, the secret of the soil grows through the eye, and blood jumps in the sun. Above the waste allotments, the dawn halts.
Thank you very much, Claire. An extraordinary poem to be written by anyone, but to be written at 19 was really quite fantastically special. And it was very much recognised as such, although many readers of the magazine actually wrote in to complain because they thought the poem was obscene, lots of gushers and that sort of thing, spouting. But also, who also wrote to Thomas after that was published was T.S. Eliot and Spender and many other poets of the day, because this poem really arrived like a depth charge. People had no idea really who it had come from. Thomas had published a few other poems, so perhaps some of the poets did, but in the wider sphere, they really didn't. And I think actually that Louis MacNeice really sort of hit the nail on the head when he described his own response to this early work. It was, he wrote, astonishingly new, and yet went back to the oldest of our roots which had long been ignored, written off, or simply forgotten. And I think this will become a constant characteristic of Thomas's work throughout his life, this incredible combination of the ancient with the excitingly new. And MacNeice goes on to say that his voice in the poem is bardic of nature. And I think that is also true. It seems to be imbued with a spirituality and wisdom that is born of millennia, not of learning. In terms of what is the poem about, Well, I'm not going to go right into every line and every stanza now, but I mean, for me, the opening stanza, light breaks where no sun shines, is an image of conception. Something is being created, the human life is being created, and the poem, over a very few stanzas, then moves outward and leaves us on these wastelands, these waste allotments. And it is obscure, but I think it is purposefully obscure, because what Thomas is doing in these poems, and in all of the poems in 18 poems, is not so much asking us what does a poem mean, as how can a poem mean. He wants to create new forms of poetic experience, to open the language up to new ways of meaning on an instinctive, maybe even an aural level. He wants it to be more of a communication, perhaps, than a description. And so paradoxically, to achieve that, obscuring the narrative is part of that. He wants the subject to inform the poem and not be the poem. Now, I think not only is Light Breaks a fantastic example of that first book, but it's an example of a poem that I think is already seeded with a lot of the successes of Thomas's future work. It's already displaying a lot of the most successful traits and devices. He himself will call them tricks in that 1951 letter that will characterize his work for the rest of his writing life. The most important, but not the most immediately apparent, is the structure he imposes upon the poem, is the structure of syllables. So a certain pattern of syllables is established in the first line, 6-10, 4-10, 4-10, 6-10, 4-10, 4-10, and this is then repeated all the way through the poem. And what this does is that despite this incredible verbal generosity, it means that the poem is crucially limited. It is constrained. It's never let entirely to have free rein. What it also creates, of course, is that sort of circulatory rhythm, this sense of a pulsing rhythm, as if the poem itself is pulsing with blood. There is too, in these early poems, in 18 poems, some glimpses of the humour and wordplay that would come to characterise Thomas's stories and, of course, Under Milk Wood. MacNeice, writing in that same essay, said that he often thought of Thomas as being a wind with a chuckle in its voice and news from the end of the world. Was that news from the end of the world coming in there somewhere? Yeah. And I think in his poetry, the chuckle often manifests itself in very sly references to demotic phrases. So light breaks where no sun shines, basically where the sun don't shine. Heads of the characters hammer through daisies, pushing up daisies. And interestingly, it's in the workings of such wordplay, in the force that through the green fuse dries the flower, that we have some really fascinating evidence of Thomas's knowledge of Welsh. Because in the margins of that poem, he has written amser, which is Welsh for time, and then he split the word into amser, which means round stars in Welsh. And in the finished poem, it's this wordplay that becomes the line, time has ticked to heaven round the stars. And rather poignantly, many years later, his daughter Aronwy, that was the line that she chose to have on a plaque above the door at the boathouse in Larne. There are many other things that I could say about the poems in 18 poems, but I should say that I've never given a lecture before, and I prepared this lecture in the style of Dylan Thomas, in that I did it late and hungover. And it's very important that we have some questions at the end, so we're about to experience a bit of a rattle through, but there we are. What I do want to say, though, about these early poems is that they are many things. They've been called biomorphic, this idea of the cosmos in the body and the body in the cosmos. They've also been called surreal. They've often been called surreal, and I think they're not surreal. And I'm going to let Thomas speak for himself here, again, in that 1951 letter. When having outlined the ideas of the surrealists, he says, I profoundly disagree. I do not mind from where the images of a poem are dragged up. Drag them up, if you like, from the nethermost sea of the hidden self. But before they reach paper, they must go through all the rational processes of the intellect. The surrealists, on the other hand, put their words down together on paper exactly as they emerge from chaos. They do not shape these words or put them in order. To them, chaos is the shape and order. And so I think, because we still hear a lot about Thomas's contribution to surrealism, but there we have a very resounding answer to why he felt his poems were not surrealist. What we also see in 18 poems, I think, is essentially the secret to why Thomas still has such a popular appeal. The voice of these poems is not whispering in your ear or muttering in a field like Robert Frost. They feel declaimed, as if from a cliff top or a deep wood. And as such, they don't feel so much like arguments or observations, but ultimate truths. And it should be said, not truths, not intimate truths of human nature. I don't think that we go to Thomas for that, but rather these cosmic fundamental truths. The American poet Elizabeth Bishop wrote once, "Writing poetry is an unnatural act." So true. It takes great skill to make it seem natural. Most of the poet's energies are really directed towards this goal, to convince themselves, and with luck, some readers, that what they're up to and what they're saying is really an inevitable, only natural way of behaving under the circumstances. I love that description of poetry. Yeah. Honest gov, there's nothing going on here, it's all natural. She goes on to compare a poem with being like a glass eye, in that a poet has to combine the real with the decidedly unreal. A poem has to be as normal as sight, yet as synthetic as a glass eye. And I think this is what Thomas does brilliantly. His poems are full of artifice, they're full of device, they're deeply unnatural, but they feel organic. They feel as though they present themselves not so much as if they've been written, but they've been discovered or uncovered, I believe. And yet, despite this and despite their obscurity, they feel familiar enough. And sort of one of the devices that Thomas uses, I think, is the noun as adjective or compound noun adjectives, the heron priested shore. And I think what that does for us is that we're still in a familiar world. We know what heron and priest means, but we've never seen them combined before. So we're in, again, a combination of a familiar world, a safe world, and an exciting world. Something else he does in the first stanza there, in Light Breaks, which he'll do all the way through 18 poems, is using the stanza as a sentence. The first full stop in his poems very often doesn't land until the end of that first stanza. So there's a sense of holding off, of sense and completion. He's very good at poetic foreplay, basically. He sort of keeps you waiting and waiting and waiting. Well, that one went down interesting, didn't it? But anyway, I think. Anyway, and for all of these reasons, and I hope you can get the drift of what I'm saying, because I've got a lot more to say, but not much time. For all of these reasons, he very quickly gained this fantastically popular following. And Claire Pollard, who read the poem there, in the interview for the documentary, she said, if there's a gateway drug for poetry, it's Dylan Thomas. And it is. He kickstarts poets, he gets them on their bike, but then they tend to ride off in the distance without him. And I just want to talk a bit about that. And I think it's related to what you could argue was a failing or a dropping off in the momentum of his voice over the collections that followed 18 poems. Because although 18 poems is seeded with his successfulness as a poet, it's also seeded, I think, with many of his weaknesses, because ironically for Thomas, they're quite often the same thing. So as well as being an entrance point for young poets and readers, he's also something of a terminal point. Because with the poems of Dylan Thomas as your introduction, where do you go next? Although we can see traces of his influence in the early work of Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, Geoffrey Hill, such is the tightrope that Thomas walks between authenticity and artifice, that to follow in his footsteps without his very specific hinterland, I think, is to risk falling into pastiche and overstatement and extending that metaphor to breaking point. And so it is true, I think, that poets tend to get turned on by Thomas and then they leave him. And it can be the similar thing with readers, because intoxication is not the same as love. And I think when we first read Thomas's work, it's an intoxicating experience. The more time they spend with his work, especially as he was putting more and more of it out into the world, it can start to provoke a reaction from adoration to a refuting almost, a turning away. And one of the reasons for this is that across his next two collections, when not drawing upon what Heaney calls the fossil fuel of his notebooks, Thomas tends to pursue his endeavour, I think, of how can a poem mean more than what it means, and he pursues it to the cost of his readers' engagement. Those narrative handholds begin to slip away, so that excitement of sound can become a bluntness of sound. In that same essay by Elizabeth Bishop, she asks 3 things of a poem: spontaneity, mystery, and accuracy. And I think that Thomas's work always has the first 2, but the accuracy begins to blur. And why does it begin to blur? Well, I think partly because metaphor images depend upon, a bit like a Venn diagram, a shared area of association. So when a poet gives you an image, there's something in it, even if it's just an echo that relates to your life. And in his middle period, that shared area gets smaller and smaller with Thomas. And so even though he, I think, never had any doubt what his poems meant, I think even he began to become aware that he was losing perhaps that narrative grasp, that engagement of his readers. He wrote again to Vernon Watkins, "I'm afraid of all the once necessary artifices and obscurities and can't for the life of me get any real liberation, any diffusion or dilution or anything into the churning bulk of words. I seem more than ever to be tightly packing away everything I have and know into a mad doctor's bag and then locking it up. All you can see is the bag. All you can know is that it is full to the clasp. All you have to trust is that the invisible and intangible things packed away are, if they could only be seen and touched, worth quite a lot." So Thomas is aware of the risk that he is running. And I think he was probably also aware that with this increasing obscurity, he was encountering a redundancy of accumulation. What I mean by that is that Thomas's voice is so particular, it's so unique, that as we receive more and more of it, without sufficient evolution in perhaps thought and philosophy, there appears to be a diminishment in its power. So, although, as I said before, each poem appears as if it was written to stand alone, without this sufficient evolution, there can be apparent devaluation of originality, never in relation to other poets, but only ever in relation to himself. A sense, I suppose, of the craft becoming crafty, that cliff top or that wood becoming a stage. And I think a vital shift where you lose a reader from being moved to feeling the poet doing the moving. And I think that was where Thomas found himself at the end of his 3rd collection, Map of Love. But thankfully, that wasn't the end of his writing. And I think if it wasn't for Deaths and Entrances, his final collection, perhaps we wouldn't be here today speaking about Thomas. Perhaps we wouldn't be having the centenary. Because it's in Deaths and Entrances that I think we really see the crowning achievement of Thomas's work. And it's in this collection that we find the poems that the world has simply not allowed to die, however much they get bashed by his own celebrity lifestyle or by critics. Fern Hill, Poem in October, A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London, In My Craft of Sullen Art, Love in the Asylum. So what was it that brought about this extraordinary comeback? What was it that sort of saved, I think, Thomas as a poet? And I'd argue it was the Second World War. The Second World War entered his life, and suddenly Thomas had to look beyond what he called his small bone island. That's what he was talking about when he was writing those biomorphic poems. He was writing screenplays and scripts. He was traveling the country. He was experiencing the Blitz firsthand. And although he didn't write much during the Second World War, I think we can see all of this feeding into the poems he writes directly afterwards. He writes 3 poems about the Blitz, and they're markedly different. They are a form of lyrical reportage. One of them, among those killed in the Dawn raid, was a man aged 100. That title is taken from a newspaper headline in Leeds. It's a massive gear change for Thomas. He's been writing really, really good propaganda film scripts, which require him to be incredibly lucid, to be narrative, but not to lose the sense of poetry. And for me, the poem that I think is the crucial turning point for poem, and which hopefully we'll be hearing in a few moments, read by Sir Andrew Motion, which is very kind of him, is the audaciously titled A Refusal to Mourn the Death of a Child by Fire in London. And I think actually maybe if we can hear the poem first, and then I'll say a few words about it. So over to Andrew Motion. Right.
Never until the mankind-making bird, beast, and flower, fathering and all-humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking, and the still hour is come of the sea tumbling in harness, and I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead, and the synagogue of the ear of corn. Shall I let pray the shadow of a sound, or sow my salt seed in the least valley of sackcloth to mourn the majesty and burning of the child's death. I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other.
It's very interesting to hear that break in the rhythm of the final line, which we also hear in Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines. Above the waste allotments, the dawn halts. After the first death, there is no other. So you can still feel with the mature Thomas his relationship to his teenage self. And I think partly what's going on here is that Thomas discovered his voice fantastically young. Most of us search for it for a lot longer. And it feels to me, this might be a slightly oversimplistic reading, but it feels to me that he almost had to wait for himself, for his experience, his maturity to catch up with his voice. And in a poem like this, you find, I think, a real perfecting of poet and poem. And it's an audacious poem. It's a poem in which essentially Thomas is saying he will not enter the public mourning of this child's death. Now, why won't he enter it? Perhaps it's because he's been writing these propaganda films. He knows that these sort of instances will be used as part of the engine of war. But he's saying, I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do it until, and he then lists out a series of impossible conditions. He won't do it essentially until the world comes to an end, until the tumbling sea is stilled in its harness, and darkness has come. And then we have, of course, he chooses, and in the first draft, he's not using words like Zion and synagogue, but he is, because the Holocaust has just happened. So he says that he won't do any of this. He will not blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. So the first full stop lands at the end of the third stanza in the poem. And in the first draft that we have of this poem, that's where the poem ends. And it would be a much weaker poem for it if it did end there. But then in this last stanza, having said he will not elegize, he will not take part in the mourning for the child, he does so, and in a fantastically sincere and heartfelt way. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long grains, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other. And that last line has been interpreted to cut both ways, either to be hopeful or to actually not be hopeful, depending on how you read it, as a reference to a Christian afterlife or not. But what I find so interesting in it is that the rhythm is a consoling rhythm. So regardless of how you read the sense of the poem, having opened in this very adversarial way, I am not going to do this, it closes on a real note of consolation and peace. And for me, it's the turning point poem for Thomas. And it's a mark that he is back on form. And I think crucially because he's negotiating that line between suggestion and description. We might not get an immediate understanding of what he means by robed in the long friends. Are these the worms? Are these the previous dead? Are they the roots of trees? But there's enough of an association for him to keep us with him. We were going to talk about Fern Hill and poem in October, and it was going to be fascinating, but you'll have to watch the documentary now for that. Because I'm going to get straight on to the last poem that we're going to hear read by someone else. You can probably, I'm assuming you can guess what it is, because after Deaths and Entrances, Thomas' poem published in Country Sleep. He only published it in America. And it's an astonishing book that shows us where I think Thomas was going. There's this idea that he was drying up. He wasn't, I think. He was writing less. He only wrote 6 published poems in the writing shed in Larne, but they were better. The quality was better. And aspirationally, I think he was significantly more mature. And there's a nuclear anxiety that is stalking these late poems. A poem on his birthday. We know that when he died, he was on his way to work with Stravinsky on a really extraordinary opera about a post-apocalyptic world that's been destroyed by nuclear war. And similarly, In Country Heaven is about a weeping God in this rural heaven, looking down on an earth that has snuffed itself out. So he'd found something to say. He'd found a concern beyond himself. But amongst these poems that are very exciting in terms of his outward look, I think, there is the extraordinary poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. There's so much that can be said about this, but I think before we hear from this poem, and I think all I'll say is that actually, again, a bit like in A Refusal to Mourn, there's a wonderful tension between sense and sound. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age and rage, rage at close of day, rage against the dying of the light. It's a great example of Thomas feeling like an ultimate truth, but then you scratch the surface and you say, how many of us do want our loved ones to rage? Do we really want that? How much of this is showmanship? How much is he winning us over? And how much of this is bluff? But then the rhythm of the poem creates a tension against that. The repetition of the lines, and of course it's the form of the villanelle, which I think is wonderful for Thomas because it forces him to be more concise. He forces him to move away from those long opening sentences. And I must admit, I tend to prefer Thomas's poems when they're a bit more like me, short and a little bit bitter. And I mean, so maybe all appreciation of poetry is just an act of narcissism, but there we are. And I think that this is what he achieves in Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. And we can't underestimate the achievement of the handling of the form. It's interesting that we heard from him earlier as a young poet saying form should not be imposed on poetry. And here he is imposing the villanelle, a form that had previously only been used for very light subjects, love and fun. And he chooses this, a poem that progresses through returning to write about the death of his father. I think at this point, we should hear it being read all the way from Princeton by Paul Muldoon.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learn too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
And you just heard that murmur through the room there. And of course, that's what Thomas does at his best. His poems alter us, perhaps as a way a piece of music might alter us. We don't have immediate understanding, but our internal weather has been changed. And actually, one of the things I was going to say about Fern Hill and Poem in October was they are fantastic examples of Thomas as the master of the turn in the poem. There's that beautiful turn in a poem in October, but then the weather turned around. And you hear it again there. And you, my father, there on the sad height. And it's a turn of rhythm. So I'm going to finish off with my conclusion, because I thought about it a lot, and I'm not going to get out of here without reading it. And then we'll hopefully have around sort of 10 or 15 minutes, if you've got any questions. So in the 20 years of his writing life, Thomas was many things, and this is something else that I think we don't talk about enough. A lyric poet, a scriptwriter, an actor, a performer, an author. But when I think of him, I must admit, I think of him as a poet of the sea, and even more specifically, the estuary at Larne, below the boathouse where he lived and the writing shed in which he wrote. The sea is ever present in his poetry, even from very early on, as are its dark vowel palavers of birds along its heron-priested shore, and so are its tides pulling and washing through his poetry like a watery metronome. Now, I said at the start of this event that people can tend to be intoxicated, they fall in love with Thomas, and then they drift away from him. And I think that's true, I'll be honest. I've fallen in and out of love with his work over the years. But exactly like those Carmarthenshire tides, we do return to him. And he's a poem that I think people return to more than most. And I think we always will, because whatever his faults and excesses, he is a reminder of a poet who I genuinely believe we need to have in our lives, a reminder of the nature of the human condition stripped bare from intellectual masking, a reminder of the natural world that is given voice with such suitable drama and strange wonder, and a reminder that poetry has its roots in music and always will. And that's why I believe that Thomas's poems, that's why they have survived, it's why they will continue to survive, because there will always be a readership who will need them and who will want to be reminded, and so that will not let them go gentle into that good night. Now, I started by talking about a desire to get back to Thomas's sullen art, and I thought we should finish with his sullen art, but not in my words, but in his own. So I'll finish with this reading, and then we'll have a chance for some questions. In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still night when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, I labour by singing light. Not for ambition or bread or the strut and trade of charms on the ivory stages, but for the common wages of their most secret heart. Not for the proud man apart from the raging moon I write on these spindrift pages, nor for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers, their arms round the griefs of the ages, who pay no praise or wages, nor heed my craft or art. Thank you very much. Justin Valiant. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I like to think that was mostly for Thomas, because it should be. Now, I know that we started late, but I've got a countdown here that tells me I've got 7 minutes, 16 seconds, but hopefully they'll be lenient upon us. So if anyone has got any questions, there are some microphones in the audience, so if you can raise your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you, that would be great. There's one down here. Yeah, just here.
Thank you very much indeed for an excellent talk. How do you think that Dylan Thomas's poetry does chime or might chime with people studying English literature at school?
It's a very interesting question, because when I travel to poetry festivals or to talk to international poets, I always ask them, who are the British poets who you read? Thomas is always in the top 3, and that's translated. I mean, how do you translate Thomas? I don't know. And that's because he's taught, and he's taught in America as, I mean, I was never taught Thomas. I was taught R.S. Thomas, which I'm very, very grateful for. He was who I sort of charged my batteries on when I was young. But I would hope, because of that immediacy in his work, because of that musicality, because of that experience of having something has changed, something has altered from the start of the page to the end of the page when you hear a Thomas poem, I would hope it's still a very good entrance point to poetry, because that is where we start as children. We start exactly as Thomas did, with nursery rhymes and with lullabies. And I actually think that he's a very good poet to start with for children as well, because it means that they're not shackled from the start to have immediate understanding and to approach a poem as a puzzle that absolutely has to be solved. It shouldn't be solved immediately. You know, Thomas said there should always be gaps and spaces that the reader has to move into, if you like. There's a way of phrasing a question on one of the, I think it's one of the AS level exam boards, which is, to what extent is such and such a poem the key of the collection? And when I do talks in schools, teachers hate me because I go, well, this is rubbish. This is ridiculous. And they're going, that's great, but they're going to fail. No, because that idea that a collection has a key, that a book of poems is something to be unlocked, I think Thomas is a great introduction for that, because it's saying, enter it on that world of sound. Absolutely, and I'm saying that he doesn't always get it right. He becomes too obscure. Enter it on that world of sound. Investigate the associations of those images, because there will be a meaning behind them. And spend time with the poem and explore them. And to be honest, I hope this doesn't sound too harsh, I always think of Thomas as a once-a-week poet for me, You read one poem a week, he's brilliant. You read 6 in quick succession, and, as I said, because he's so unique, it can start to feel, it can be a different form of experience. So I think you pick the right poems, you put them in front of children, and you let them hear them. They've got to hear them. There's no reason why he can't be a fantastic introduction. Okay. Are there any more? Yes, there's one up there. Yep.
Thank you, Owen, for that most stimulating, inspiring introduction to Thomas, for those of us perhaps not as familiar with him. Following on from the last question then, can you suggest why he is sidelined and dismissed by academia in universities? America, of course, he's heroically acclaimed.
Well, actually, not as much as he was. It was interesting. For the documentary, we spent some time in America, and we realised he's not taught. He's read a lot more, I think. And partly, you look at early Sylvia Plath, absolutely packed full of influence with Thomas. She finished with one boyfriend because he wasn't enough like Dylan Thomas, And she partly was attracted to Ted Hughes because he had that same sort of bardic quality to him. But as I said before, his strengths, I think, can be seen as his weaknesses. I think there's a suspicion that Thomas doesn't have an intellectual agenda, and on one level, perhaps he doesn't to the same extent of other poets, but I'd say that maybe that's his strength. I think in America, he hit America at the perfect time. If you think about it, it was just before, James Dean, the 1950s, the rebellious youth. The decade before had been called by Lowell, I think, the bland decade. Here came this bohemian poet who was challenging the establishment, which is why, Bob Dylan took his name and never gave it back. But as to why he isn't studied, I haven't got a clean answer, only that you get a sense of suspicion about Thomas. I said earlier, that there's this public idea, maybe he's a bit of a bardic trickster, a one-trick poet. It was interesting making the documentary. I was, from several revered publishing houses, editors didn't want to talk about it because they didn't really say, I suppose there's lots to talk about with the life, isn't there? What was lovely with the poets I interviewed is that they'd all done exactly what I just spoke about. They'd all read him as teenagers. So Simon Armitage and Joe Shapcott literally bought their school day books with them, which still had their annotations. It was great. Simon Armitage's just had single nouns beside each poem: love, hate, death, which is sort of right, really. But they hadn't gone back to him since. So what we get in the documentary is we get this sort of almost this evangelical response, because now they're going back as experienced adult writers and they're appreciating the craft. And that's the bit that I don't understand about not being studied in academia, because of course you can criticize Thomas. We should. We need to live in an environment of rich and honest criticism. We can't have this rosy nostalgia. But in terms of for something to study, his syllabic structures, his use of rhythm, his use of a very limited monosyllabic vocabulary. It all revolves around moon, star, womb, tide, and yet it works. There's a lot to get your teeth into. So I don't know, but I know, that when I was at Oxford, I didn't know anyone who was teaching him and anyone who was even thinking of teaching him, which is a shame because, as I said, he was a seismic event, whatever you think of him, and he did influence a lot of other very interesting poets, and so he deserves to be studied along with everyone else. We've got 45 seconds for the next question. I think so. So there's one more over here. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. But following on from the last question, I was very interested the week before last, I think, to listen to a series of essays on Radio 3. And there I had an insight into an aspect of Thomas that might be useful here, which was that his parents, I gathered, were both Welsh-speaking, but were determined that he should not be. And he grew up without any Welsh at all. So I was quite interested that he had some that he referred to. But that fact caused some resentment amongst his contemporaries and the people who immediately came after during the period of intense efforts to get Welsh re-established as a language. And I wonder if that has anything to do with the issue that you were just talking about.
I don't think so, to be honest. And I think he had a lot more Welsh than he's obviously sort of given credit for. I mean, his uncle was a Welsh language preacher. That's partly where that hoil comes of his presentation style. And every time he'd have gone back to Llansteffan and Fern Hill, he would have heard Welsh. So he would have been familiar with Welsh. It was very, very typical of the day that his parents didn't expose him to Welsh and that he wasn't taught Welsh. So actually, his contemporaries would have been largely in the same situation, I think. So I don't think that's because, if anything, he fell out of favour outside of Wales first, where people weren't concerned with those linguistic endeavours. I mean, I suppose you might argue that might have happened at a certain point, but there's such a strong vein of whatever you call it, Anglo-Welsh writing or Welsh writing in English, that I don't think that there's any evidence that Thomas's lack of Welsh led to that being the case. And also, I mean, I think that the Welsh language is, I briefly mentioned Cynhanydd earlier, and even the idea of the poet as a bard, a bardic poet, all of that is feeding into Thomas. So he's still a poet who's informed by the language, even if he didn't speak it. And I'd like to think that that wasn't the reason. And I started off, commenting about the centenary and sort of slightly joking, but also slightly not joking about going, God, it's been 3 months, enough already. But quite genuinely, I think actually the centenary will also do something very interesting. It's been a fantastic opportunity to reposition his work, to introduce it to new people. I thought that the BBC's Under Milk Wood was great because although it wasn't a coherent narrative, there was the poetry, front and centre. Although Kathleen Jenkins as Polly Garter. Anyway, obviously something that we don't know about Kathleen Jenkins. Anyway, so I think I'd like to finish on that positive point, that saying that we need to be honest about Thomas, we need to be clear-eyed about Thomas, we need to appreciate the best of his work. He's a very strange poet in that his praisers and his detractors quite often don't read the poems. There are poems that I didn't even mention here, an extraordinary sequence called Vision and Prayer. So I would recommend people, I would prescribe you to read one a week. But to go back to the stuff that you haven't heard before because it's worth it, and he was unique, and he's extraordinary, and he's ours, and we should celebrate him. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Thank you.